Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I saw Jessica's energy egregiously violate mine multiple times after my last release on this podcast, which prompted me to check if she recently streamed, which she just so happened to decide to do right around the time I made my last release on this podcast. This is far from the first time I've felt my energy violated by Jessica spiritually, but I've intentionally tried to avoid giving her much attention in the past because I felt there were much more important things for me to address and focus on, and I didn't want to seem like I was disingenuously obsessed with her or something. But this time, things felt really weird. I saw Jessica's energy saying I'm protected and there's some kind of payout coming in, and a bit before that, I saw Imane's energy talking about someone trying to blackmail and or frame me. I'd imagine most likely as a continuation of attempts to frame me for the murder I've already mentioned multiple times I suspect I'm being framed for, by coming in, pretending to be a friend, and trying to hand me a bag or place a bag around me and try to make it seem like some kind of payment for something. Such a thing actually happened to me this morning, and I felt extremely violated spiritually. This morning, around 8 a.m., as I happened to randomly be looking through some garbages, looking for some food leftovers right around the same government-owned building I'd encountered the hitman I mentioned in my last release on this podcast, I extremely strangely came across a McDonald's bag with a bunch of dirty, half-smoked cigarettes in it, some looking like they had some burns on them, as if they'd been tossed in one of those cigarette disposal box things you see sometimes, and had later been retrieved and placed in that bag specifically to be planted there. Creeped me out instantly. I took one of the half-smoked cigarettes out simply out of curiosity, but I suddenly felt this really strange feeling like I was being watched. I turned around and I saw a man walking right towards me. It wasn't the first time I'd seen this man. I'd encountered him a couple times in the past around a plaza where he asked me for a cigarette on a couple occasions, which I had to decline, obviously, as I don't even have money to buy food, much less cigarettes. He's also tried approaching me at the same building in the past, again trying to act like we're friends, to which I had also respectfully refused to entertain. At this point, he's basically a stalker to me, and one that I'm increasingly fearing for my safety and life because of. I don't know that man and don't want to get to know him. I certainly don't see him as a friend, but he approached me as if he's my friend or something, and even more strangely, he offered to give me the drink he was holding and then even offered to buy me breakfast. Obviously, feeling increasingly creeped out, I respectfully declined. He walked away into the building and ultimately disappeared shortly after, but I was left feeling like I was being watched and someone had taken pictures and or video in continued attempts to frame me for the murder of the individual I've mentioned before that I feel I'm getting framed for the murder of. From what I'm hearing spiritually, apparently the male I suspect I'm being framed for the murder of was selling his body and was trying to make it seem like I'm also the type to sell my body. He made me rather uncomfortable on a couple occasions, once randomly coming and sitting beside me out of nowhere, and another time randomly walking by me with one of his friends and telling me I have nice feet. Both occurrences were exceptionally uncomfortable and strange to me, and again, that male was neither my friend nor anyone I've ever been or would ever be at all consensually, romantically, and or sexually interested in and or involved with. Anyways, some parts of Jessica's stream, she happened to start right around the time I made my last release on this podcast. Cleaning. A cleaner in the Shadow Confederation is someone who murders someone themselves or causes them to get murdered and then cleans up the evidence they leave behind that would incriminate themselves. So I see that stream Jessica did as an attempt to cover up her involvement in conspiring and attempting to murder me. Although I'm a permanent chief, I don't get to dictate every member of the Shadow Confederation, nor their specific roles, because there are several other high-ranking members, and I've never been the type to carelessly strip individuals of their power in the overall structure. I find it quite curious that Jessica's apparently moving. I should be moving right now, moving out of this extremely life-threatening deprivation, homelessness, and into a situation actually starting to see justice. Yet Jessica's the one moving for some reason. More destiny swap stuff. And then there's Jessica specifically mentioning she keeps repeating she wants to move in the most peaceful way possible. There's some kind of conflict drawn around Jessica wanting to move somehow not peacefully. That seriously suggests to me that there's some particular reason her friends would suspect she has reason to want to cause a huge scene while moving, serving as further incriminating evidence that Jessica is indeed much more heavily involved in all this than any evidence I've previously presented really adequately substantiates. Shortly after mentioning moving, Jessica revealed some big brand name lip balm product unusually packaged in an unnecessarily large box. Kind of disturbing to me, honestly. Cherries don't have any particular significance to me, in case that's worth mentioning. Although I'm quite certain the dark red color relates to some kind of false narratives being perpetuated about this podcast entirely against my consent to my detriment. I've already described there's an extremely devious context behind the scenes misrepresenting the significance of people wearing lip balm, originating from Kimmy through her exploitation of narratives misrepresenting the true significance of me ever showing interest in her wearing lip gloss many years ago. The concept of unboxing is also again present, and in a blatantly unusual circumstance, in this case in relation to the size and appropriateness of the box for its purpose. Perhaps this is a representation of Jessica trying to force some kind of association between me and her by trying to seem accommodating of me supposedly desiring much more room to navigate whatever defamation she might have intentionally been involved in perpetuating about me than she ever actually had any good reason to believe I'd want or need. But that's just a guess. Since Jessica mentioned that it has a little bit of the plumping feeling, perhaps I should mention that I do not and have never had any particular interest in or fixation with lips being made more plump or even their natural plumpness. It seems whatever false narratives going on around that are like a less exaggerated version of whatever egregious defamation of me might have been suggesting to Kimmy that I'd want anyone to get Botox, so it seems I'm getting closer to identifying and eliminating the source of it. Perhaps it's Kimmy specifically that's in reality been the one trying to pressure Jessica to give her more room to navigate around perpetuating false narratives about me in relation to lip gloss and lip balm and all that kind of stuff. A little later, Jessica randomly starts talking about and showing off a few different makeups and perhaps general self-care products, initially suggesting Celine used the same lip balm thing she'd applied earlier. So it seems to me that Kimmy's been intentionally misleading Celine on supposed leverage Celine would have over me by wearing certain lip glosses or lip balms or whatever at certain times, and Kimmy's been exploiting Jessica to have that influence on Celine. This would explain further why Celine felt so confident in participating in conspiracy and attempts to murder me. The name Anna doesn't mean anything special to me, but I suspect it has something to do with a Jamie and or Lena energy trying to exploit Jessica and or Celine to existentially assault me for selfish gain, again
through lies in relation to lip gloss and lip balm type products that Kimmy originally was responsible for misrepresenting the reality of the significance of in relation to my existence. This perhaps explains the nature of the codependent connection that Kimmy and Jamie have had in more recent times that Jamie was recently complaining about. The name Nicole reminds me of one of my biological cousins that my biological uncle, John, once made some strange creepy implications around me that made me feel like he thought I had some kind of romantic and or sexual feelings towards her or something like that for reasons unknown to me. Perhaps either he's been trying to mask his own perverted feelings towards her by trying to destiny swap the karma for it on me, and or Nicole herself has some strange fixation or obsession with me despite knowing those feelings are not reciprocated by me at all. I haven't even seen her since she was a child, and I'm certainly not romantically and or sexually attracted to literal children. I never have been. I don't understand why Jessica would hate her hair. It looks lovely. I wish I had such nice hair. I wouldn't say there's anything she needs or even should particularly want to change about her hair. She clearly takes care of it, and I've never discouraged anyone from taking care of their hair. Her hair length is nice. I prefer straight hair, so her go-to of curling it shows me that we most likely have a substantial difference in aesthetic preferences in general if I'm really going to go to the point of trying to relate to her so she doesn't feel extremely aggressively attacked by me, pointing out everything I'm saying here as if it's some weird, disingenuous, romantic and or sexual thing and or being done with some kind of ulterior motive in general. I certainly relate to the feeling of feeling like I constantly have to prove myself when I shouldn't have to, but Jessica's specific word choice surrounding that notion suggests to me that she's being deceptive, since it doesn't make sense to always have to prove yourself when you don't really need to. I also feel like there's a rather stark contrast between me having to prove myself with extensive rhetoric around the reality of my existence as I intertwine it with knowledge of the law, technology, philosophy, psychology, and a clearly articulable interpretation of a fundamentally unbreakable mental framework I've extensively proven my possession of in how I've dealt with various highly influential forces, versus how Jessica seems to need to prove herself with, like, showing off what makeup she uses and how she interprets astrology as she gets spoon-fed information from ChatGPT. It's crazy how Jessica's saying that as she gets older, she feels like her memory's worse and worse. How is she already supposedly experiencing substantial memory loss in her mid-20s? Seems like she's intentionally lying to avoid accountability for malice she secretly knows she's been exerting on others behind the scenes, at least to me. Especially the malice she's exerting in relation to this conflict I'm exposing her involvement in. Suddenly, right as I'm proving and exposing everything publicly, now Jessica has spontaneous memory loss? I don't think so. Jessica gave this whole explanation from ChatGPT on what various aspects of you from astrology means, but I interpret each aspect of it differently entirely. I see the sun sign as the effective consequence of your existence during the daytime, the moon sign as the effective consequence of your existence during the nighttime, your rising as what you effectively utilize to try to grow in life, and the Venus thing I just don't really understand or have a clear explanation for right now. It's possibly a heavily AI-driven and essentially otherwise useless indicator, perhaps related to how you might make income if you have a codependent relationship with AI like ChatGPT. I could ask ChatGPT about all that stuff for me, but there are a couple main reasons I don't care to do so. First of all, the date on your birth certificate or what your parents might tell you is probably to some extent a lie in many cases, especially if you know you have extremely abusive and manipulative ones like I know Dixon and Mary have always been to me. They can technically lie when they go to register you for a birth certificate with the government, and they can also lie to you personally even if they admit they lied on your birth certificate. I choose to operate assuming they lied on both fronts if I'm going to start betting my life on the outcome that might result from me committing to any astrological sign alignment, meaning I won't ever be committing to fundamentally existentially depending on any astrology-based signs. One additional consequence of this is that, for example, I never resonate with any of the times I see readings saying certain number sequences will have some kind of particular significance or resonate with me. Also, a lot of the relevancy of your sign alignment becomes irrelevant or invalidated if you refuse to embrace all 4 major aspects of it, even theoretically or temporarily, and I obviously refuse to embrace the Venus component since I'm not even really sure what it actually represents and wouldn't want to have a codependent relationship with AI to survive financially or in general, even if I could. This means that I'm only going to seek love from a fully natural place, perhaps just using astrology stuff as some guide randomly as I please intuitively, and not see any astrological markers as a definitive deterministic science in any capacity. While I can appreciate if Jessica was trying to suggest her intent was good in trying to grow closer to me or hold a place in her heart for me or something like that, I imagine she could understand why I see her attitude as at the very least somewhat condescending and pretentious in doing so, as it quite substantially neglects the level of intellect and emotional awareness she should have been well aware I possess. I also find it exceptionally shady that she said she thought she's a Libra moon, where I see physical murder attempts being made on me at night following spiritual murder attempts from Kimmy, who's a Libra. On top, Jessica's also Aries rising, where Arya, who's an Aries, carries public official responsibility for the murderous white heart emoji energy that Kimmy's been channeling to try to cause my murder because of Chloe. So, from an astrology standpoint, Jessica can blame Chloe for leading to Jessica misreading her own moon sign, which I imagine might be rather relevant to you if you relate to and probably depend on astrology as much as I imagine Jessica probably does. I'm really not trying to hate on Jessica, but I feel like it's quite telling that she needs to literally actively probe AI live on stream several times to essentially function in a meaningful capacity to even proceed with that stream in the direction she wanted to at one point. It seems to me like she's been trying extremely hard to avoid ever reaching a point of getting exposed for abusing AI like ChatGPT extremely extensively to selfishly gain off knowingly and intentionally enabling and facilitating the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me in real life through her deep connection with Kimmy and Jamie behind the scenes that I feel is much deeper than she perhaps might generally communicate or come off as having with her public behavior. I don't know if Jessica actually fundamentally really enjoys having what I feel is a really uncomfortably aggressive attitude when it comes to passionate feelings, like wanting to kiss someone, or if that's a manifestation of Jessica feeling forced against her will to comply with a structure exploiting AI heavily to an extent she herself doesn't even feel comfortable attacking me as much as she must increasingly clearly know she is. But any notion of Jessica genuinely feeling attracted to me and seriously wanting to pursue any kind of romantic and or sexual involvement with her feels extremely off to me intuitively, only increasingly so the more I'm essentially being forced to deal with being exposed to some kind of attempt to push me in that direction. Jessica questions her own supposed stupidity in a really strange manner, which to me suggests that she's implying she's not nearly as stupid as she perhaps presents herself to be publicly at times. I've never even really paid enough attention to her to even really have a solid grasp on what I gauge her intelligence to be, and I'm certainly smart enough to recognize that a lot of content creators don't actually reveal their true intelligence level publicly in their content, especially not extremely clearly in every bit of content they put out. I suspect she feels particularly offended at some perception she has of me seeing her as particularly stupid for some reason, though, and I see that as her having attention-seeking tendencies if I'm correct about it. I get the feeling that these egregious false narratives being perpetuated about me attempt to frame me as some extremely malicious bad faith actor that was trying to really destroy Kimmy's life all along, failed, and now am, for some reason, trying to do the same thing to Jessica. These narratives are originating in egregious defamation of me that's distinctly intentionally being reported, obviously entirely against my consent, by two malicious bad faith actors in particular, at least from what I can discern from Jessica's experience. She described it manifesting in her life as basically getting in between her relations with someone she likes and perhaps has, or at the very least wants to have, more serious romantic and or sexual relations with, along with Jessica's presence in that person's life, cascading into awkwardness and perhaps even at times especially negative emotion for that person that Jessica's likely getting at least partially blamed for the consequences of wrongdoing. I see this as a manifestation of Kimmy misrepresenting the reality of how my pursuit of the kind of connection I've always wanted with her has actually impacted her life, likely making it seem like I intentionally, maliciously was trying to sabotage her connection with Edison and deepen whatever childhood traumas led her to the unhealthy connection with him that she's formed, which was the foundation for her exploiting me for years to enable and facilitate her having a secret child with him for selfish financial gain to live the careless, reckless, overly indulgent, luxurious lifestyle she wanted to live, obviously entirely at my expense against my consent. I was never trying to enable and or facilitate her to use Edison and or anyone else to feed her narcissistic tendencies to manipulate others for selfish gain of any kind, although she was only ever really empowered to subject me to that nightmare, ultimately because of Chloe Jenkins' lies to Lily that I've exposed many details of the reality behind already. Chloe caused countless cases of awkwardness and especially negative emotion between me and Kimmy that I never wanted to occur. And I was left with Kimmy blaming me for it wrongly all the time, as if I was actually benefiting somehow from the whole thing, when in reality I was being exclusively negatively impacted from it all at all times. Jessica seems to me to repeatedly, randomly be trying to, bend over and sort of show off her butt, which sort of feels to me like it's being portrayed as if that's something I particularly want or something. In reality, it does not appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me. This probably further relates to Kimmy presenting egregious false narratives in relation to the reality of why and how I originally was offering Kimmy opportunities to subtly show off her butt, specifically personally for my pleasure on stream in the past many years ago, when it had reached a point where it just made sense to me that it seemed like she wanted me to communicate my desires for her like that, for her to be able to believe they were even real. The false narratives try to make it seem like I've been lying about finding Kimmy so unbelievably, incomparably, extremely physically attractive, perhaps especially maliciously in relation to how arousing I've always said her butt is to me. By lying that it doesn't make sense, I'm not much more aroused by Jessica's butt. Look, I'm really not trying to be a creep, and it doesn't feel right to me to give Jessica attention like that, and that's why I'm not doing so. But if I absolutely have to comment on it, Jessica does actually have a really nice butt. It's just not as nice as Kimmy says, at least to me. As a whole, Jessica's far from ugly to me. She's just not as attractive as Kimmy. That doesn't mean I don't find Jessica extremely physically attractive compared to most other people. It just means she isn't the absolute perfection of a goddess of utmost physical sex appeal I could ever fathom existing. It's not meant to be offensive or make you feel bad somehow if I say I don't find you as physically attractive as Kimmy. It's just my personal preference. Like, I find Kimmy substantially more physically attractive than Kim Kardashian even. But that's not meant to insult Kim Kardashian or make her feel bad somehow. It's just how I personally feel. I understand why many people find Kim Kardashian extremely physically attractive, and I'm not trying to say they're weird for it personally. If anything, I recognize I'm quite weird for finding Kimmy as physically attractive as I do, but it's just how things are. Also, Jessica's red and white general color scheme of her clothing on that stream is giving me weird, heavily politically involved vibes that are in direct conflict with my authentic preferences of never having children, suggesting that Jessica perhaps feels justified in attacking me because she's been egregiously misled by Kimmy and Jamie, but I've had malice in how I treated them because I've made it abundantly evident that I've never at all wanted children with either of them or anyone else, as far as they can tell. Naturally, this probably stems from Chloe's egregious defamation of me trying to trap me into an extremely unhealthy, codependent relationship with her, where she's trying to rob me of my soul and ultimately get me murdered in real life by pretending to ever have really wanted and had serious intentions to actually pursue having children with me for any actually healthy reasons, if at all. My increasingly substantiated and clear recognition of this is only further reason for me to avoid any willingness to ever even at all entertain the idea of allowing Chloe back into my life in any capacity to any extent ever again. Interesting that Jessica ends her stream saying she loves her audience and specifically to be safe and take care of themselves. It seems like she even knows she tends to attract an audience that's been left in an extremely unsafe environment and made to have considerable difficulty even taking basic care of themselves due to her lifestyle choices. If I'm to assume she's not behaving with absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent, then I really shouldn't have to continually address her content over and over now, like I've had to with Kimmy and Jamie, even just to survive constant murder attacks on me in real life. Accordingly, if I continue to fail to receive truly adequate and broad public recognition even after this, and especially if I feel further spiritually violated by Jessica and feel compelled to address her Sunday stream, and on top of all that, I don't even get directly contacted by Kimmy and remain alive to pursue the kind of connection with Kimmy that she should be contacting me to pursue should I show her I have desire to do so in a potential response to that communication, then I want it extremely clearly understood that any further attention I give Jessica is not some kind of strange, disingenuous obsession with her, but rather a literal life or death scenario of me absolutely needing to defend myself against her extremely devious, fully conscious and intentional, egregious defamation of me that she's clearly been fully consciously and intentionally enabling Kimmy and Jamie to perpetuate as means to an end to ultimately cause me to get murdered in real life.